Hey everybody, this is Pierre Quinn, and you're listening to episode number 87 of the Leading While Green podcast, where my mission is to help you live, learn, and lead with confidence. On this episode of the podcast, I am joined by Corey Phelps. Corey is an associate professor of strategy and the associate dean of executive education at McGill University. He is a frequent keynote speaker, corporate trainer, award-winning researcher, and consultant on the topics of strategy and innovation. And we have a great conversation on strategic thinking, on problem solving, and why you should go deep before you jump to conclusions. So, listen up. Glad to be back on the podcast, at the podcast, in the podcast. I know I've been away for a couple of weeks and had to take a hiatus, had to take a break. I had so much going on and I needed some space and some time to think clearly and to put myself in the best possible position so that I could come back and give you quality content and great conversations with leaders from across the country. And I wanted to be in a space to do that. So I had to take a short break, but I'm back. Now, I want to encourage those of you who are listening to the podcast to recognize when you need to take a break and take that break. Some of you have vacation hours stacked up. You burn the candle at both ends and in the middle. And eventually it's going to wear you out and you're going to be no good to the people that depend on you. So take the break when you need to. Sometimes it's a one-day thing. Sometimes you might need to take a week off or a season. Who knows what it looks like for you? But for whatever it looks like for you, make sure you take your breaks so you can be at your best. Speaking of being at your best, I want to encourage you to check out my website, pierrequinn.com. And on my website, I have a free course, 12 Ways to Grow as a Leader. It's content that I share with leadership teams across the country on how to be better leaders and how to grow stronger teams. And I'm giving it to you away. I'm giving it away to you for free. So you want to check that out at pierrequinn.com. Also check out my signature course, Leading While Green, which is based on much of the content from my book, Leading While Green. Great deep dive into really the basics of leadership and how to take your leadership to the next level. You want to check that out also on my website, pierrequinn.com. Okay, conversation today is with Corey Phelps, and we have a great conversation about strategic thinking, about problem solving, and about the common mistakes that leaders make. The mistake of jumping to conclusions because we think we know situations and we think we know what's going on, and how when we don't do our research and when we don't have proper conversations and when we don't do that deep dive, we miss out on the things that really need to be done. So here's my conversation with Corey Phelps. So the podcast, I'm excited to have joining me Corey Phelps. Corey is an accomplished keynote speaker. He's a corporate trainer. He's an award-winning business school professor, and he is currently Associate Dean of Executive Education and Professor of Strategy at McGill University. He earned his PhD from NYU, and he is the co-author of the book Cracked It: How to Solve Big Problems and Sell Solutions Like Top Strategy Consultants. Corey, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for the opportunity, Pierre. Appreciate it.
So let's go back. Let's go back into your personal narrative and timeline. What were maybe some of the experiences that let you know early on, maybe in high school, maybe early in college, that you wanted to work in the area of organizational development, growth, and strategic thinking?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's a question I don't get. So thanks for the opportunity to answer it. Well, I first have to say I was born into an education family. So my father was an English literature professor. So I think I had the bug to be a teacher at a very early age. The interest in strategy and innovation and problem solving also started at a very early age. I would say it manifested itself as me taking apart our kitchen appliances because I wanted to understand how they worked, much to the dismay of my parents. And as I got older, what I started to realize, and this was particularly in high school, was, there are organizations, there are companies behind these technological products that we take for granted and use on an everyday basis. And I got very intrigued about what does it take for a group of people to produce something that, I don't know, creates toast or bakes things or gives you ice out of a refrigerator? So it was very much sort of my innate interest in all things mechanical, technological, and then a growing realization that there are organizations behind this, and then starting to think about, well, I'd like to understand that a little bit more. So when I would say, yes, this was during and after my MBA, I worked in the area of strategy consulting for a company that at the time was called AT&T Global Information Solutions. It's a long name. It was NCR because AT&T had bought us. And I worked in a group there that was very much at the intersection of strategy and information technology consulting. So that fueled my flame and my interest in the intersection of innovation and organizations, because I got to work with a lot of organizations that were struggling with how to improve their performance with technology. And then that sort of was a natural path to becoming a professor, because the great thing about being a professor, one of the great things is whatever question that you're interested in answering from a research perspective, you can work on it forever. As long as you can publish things about it, your innate curiosity can drive you for a long period of time. So that was sort of the evolution to getting to where I am today as an academic researcher and someone interested in strategy and innovation.
Now, I know I have some MBA graduates and maybe even some MBA students that listen to the podcast. And can you talk for a bit about this, maybe transition from doing a case study in a vacuum in a classroom on a project setting, and then working in real time with clients with all of their nuances and quirks and issues? You're out of that vacuum. And sometimes students and young professionals can be thrown off because we're no longer in the perfect vein of that case study. How did you make that transition as a professional?
How did I make it as a professional? Well, it's funny. I didn't do much in my own undergraduate training in the way of case studies. It was very much something that I got into in terms of organization, strategy, and consulting from a professional standpoint. So I didn't really have the formal analytical training that MBA students get with a lot of case studies. I did a little bit of that in my undergraduate, a little bit of that in my own MBA program, but it was very much learning by doing. And that's where I very much realized that if we're going to talk about the subject of problem solving and innovation and creativity, these things are highly politicized inside organizations. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing that as a professor, that a case has a very difficult time conveying to people. So I'll give you a very simple example. So the book, as you mentioned, is about problem solving, and it's very much written for an audience that is interested in solving complex organizational problems. Now, that is often the domain of strategy consultants, and strategy consultants are hired to solve complex organizational problems. And what a lot of times new consultants don't really appreciate is the problem that they have been hired to solve inside the organization is a political hot potato, in the sense that there are different stakeholder groups with different sort of agendas, different power bases that are all lobbying for their interpretation, their framing of the problem being pushed forward and other groups being discounted. So the sort of young strategy consultant walks into this and thinks, I'm going to bring my analytical toolkit to bear. And what they don't often realize is that they are effectively trying to be manipulated to shape the problem and shape the interpretation of it, and therefore shape the evolution of searching for a solution by these different internal groups. So I think that's something that the case study as a teaching tool inside business schools has a very difficult time grasping. So case studies are great because the good case studies are problem focused. So they do lend themselves to, I would say, critical reasoning and the analytical toolkit of problem solving. But all problem solving and critical thinking takes place in a context, an organizational context. Mm-hmm. And I think the young consultants have to have a very strong appreciation and understanding of that landscape in order to do their job well.
One of the things that we see, and not just in the strategy consultant world, but for many young professionals who are hired in a position where they have influence, they are decision makers, even if it's a mid-management position is wrestling with what you just mentioned in terms of sometimes these politicized environments where people come in and they want to be the first one to take you out to coffee or the first one to have lunch with you and share their side of the story. And sometimes as young professionals, we develop this knee-jerk reaction of taking this one person's advice as the rule and standard and move on that primarily. What are some of the reasons as professionals that we have that knee-jerk reaction of jumping to conclusions, and what can we do to counter it?
Another great question. So you're right. We do as human beings tend to jump to solutions, and it's often because of a little bit of information that we collect very early on in the problem solving process. And I think your example is great. That person that takes you out for the coffee that starts to lay out their narrative of what they think is the cause of the problem. And very quickly, what our minds do as human beings is we start to spin a story. We start to make sense of how the problem's been explained to us. In this case, it's been explained to us by a person that has a particular viewpoint on it and possibly a particular agenda. And then the temptation is to use that a little bit of information to weave a story that then helps us think, oh, I know exactly what the solution to this problem is. And I think the real downside is not talking to others that have a different perspective, because to your point, the way to push back against this is to identify very early on who are the stakeholders in this organizational problem, identifying who they are, and then trying to understand them. In other words, meeting with them and then trying to get the diversity of perspective, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to listen just to one side of the argument, to use that to jump to a very quick solution, and then realize very deep into the problem solving process, maybe after you started to pitch the solution, that you completely have misunderstood the mark because you only paid attention to one stakeholder group or to potentially one particular individual. So again, identifying who the stakeholders are and having conversations with them up front is one thing. And then there are other things. I mean, in the book, we talk about a framework that we have that basically imposes some discipline on you as a problem solver. We call it the Tosca framework. And it basically says, if you're facing any problem, understand what it is that you're trying to solve. And basically, we walk you through a few different elements of that. The Tosca framework, the T stands for trouble. In other words, anytime we think of a problem, there's trouble there. In other words, something tells us that we have a problem. So maybe you have an employee attrition problem. Your people are leaving and you're not quite sure why. So clearly you want attrition to be, let's say, 5% a year. It's 20%. So that's trouble. Then you got to ask, who's the owner of the problem? And again, this is a critical stakeholder. Who's going to be held responsible inside the organization for the resolution of this problem? Identifying them, understanding how they view the problem, understanding how they view what is success going to look like, which is the S in our Tosca framework. So what does success look like? How do we know we've effectively solved the problem? And again, you want to get this from different stakeholder groups' perspectives. The C in the Tosca framework is constraints. What are the things that you absolutely can't do in solving this problem? What's, like in New York City with the subway system, what's the third rail? If you touch it, you will die. Constraints are usually resource constraints. They're often rules or cultural norm constraints. So again, what are the things that are the constraints? And then finally, as I've just mentioned, who are those stakeholders? If you basically have the discipline to walk through each of those elements, you're much less likely to ignore important perspectives, and you're much less likely to quickly jump to a solution.
Sometimes as leaders and influencers and problem solvers, that adage holds true that sometimes the danger to our next success is the last success that we've experienced. Talk to us, and I know you framed this in your book, about the experience of maybe you've solved problems in one organization or helped bring about the strategizing around solutions in one organization. And then sometimes feeling like when you're working with another organization that's similar, that I got to figure out, I know what to do, and you don't necessarily go through that same framework or pattern again. What's the challenge to that, and how can we work through that?
That's another great question. Thanks for the opportunity. So what you're referring to is reasoning by analogy. Now, as some of your listeners probably know, reasoning by analogy is A, one of the things that makes us human, and B, it actually helps us tremendously. And it helps us because as human beings, we often find ourselves in situations we've never encountered before. And rather than being frozen or paralyzed in those situations, what we have the ability to do is we have the ability to reach back in our memory and ask a real basic question. Have I seen something like this before? Maybe it's not this exact problem or this exact situation, but have I seen something like this before? And if I have, I can then ask myself, well, what worked there? And if it worked there, chances are to work here. So reasoning by analogy asks us to compare a current situation to something we faced in the past. And then it often leads us to saying what that solution was in the past, it's going to work in this case. And again, that has a tremendous amount of benefit, but there's a downside to that. And you alluded to it. The downside is that we often force a new situation to look like an old situation. And if we dug a little bit deeper and really tried to understand it, these two situations would be fundamentally different. And as a result, the solution that we take from the past isn't going to work. And we tell a story in the book that I think illustrates this tremendously well. And it's a story about Ron Johnson, who is someone that spent his entire career in the United States in retail. He helped create what we take for granted today are Target stores, right? So Target stores, upscale merchandise with brands, often celebrity brands sold at everyday low prices. He was the senior vice president of merchandising there. Then he goes and helps Steve Jobs at Apple create the Apple Store. So this guy, he's got the Midas touch, highly successful at Target, highly successful at Apple. Then JCPenney, a century-old retailer, hires him away to try to help save this dying department store chain. So on the day that it was announced that Ron Johnson was to be CEO, the stock price of JCPenney went up by 18 percentage points. So clearly investors thought this is the right guy to fix what ails JCPenney. Within less than 3 months, Johnson announces to the world, I know what the solution is. So he, at the Fashion Week in New York City in January, this is back in January 2012, he announces to the world what the solution to what ails JCPenney is. And it consists of 4 pillars. Number one, we're going to eliminate all price discounting, because JCPenney was an aggressive sales promoter and an aggressive price discounter. We're going to move to an everyday low pricing strategy. Pillar number 2 is we're going to completely change the way we merchandise. So traditionally, you walked into a JCPenney store, you saw men's suits, you saw children's wear, you saw homeware. So merchandise was organized by function. Johnson said, we're going to blow that up. And what we're going to move to is we're going to move to organizing by brands. So the concept was 100 boutiques within a store. You would walk into a JCPenney, you'd see the Levi's boutique, you'd see the Martha Stewart boutique, you'd see the Joe Fresh boutique. So you'd see the merchandise now organized by brand. The third thing he did was he said the JCPenney name is old, it's out of date. We're going to drop the JCPenney name and call ourselves JCP. So all lowercase letters, came up with a new logo to convey this new, young, hip look and to reflect the changes that were being made in terms of everyday low pricing and in terms of reorganizing the merchandise. The last thing he did was he, to a great extent, eliminated a lot of the cash registers inside the JCPenney stores. He wanted store personnel to be out on the sales floor, engaging with customers. So he got rid of a lot of the cash registers. He equipped the sales personnel with handheld tablet computers that had point of sale functionality. So you could swipe a person's credit card or debit card and check them out on the floor. So he announces this change in January, and then he immediately starts to roll out all of these changes across over 1,100 stores in the United States and JCPenney. It ends up costing JCPenney over $1 billion to roll out this solution, and it was an absolute disaster. JCPenney customers rejected this in mass. I'll give you one statistic. Same store sales, which is a barometer of success in retail. So you compare your store sales this year versus the previous year. In JCPenney, after Johnson implemented these changes, same store sales fell by 25%. That is a dramatic fall off. And what this indicated was his solution, his changes greatly alienated JCPenney customers. And again, if you think about the elements of his solution, they sound awfully familiar. Some of these elements were
Hmm.
pulled from Target, everyday low pricing,
Hmm.
organizing merchandise by brand, equipping store personnel with handheld computers. That sounds an awful lot like Apple stores, right? Sleek new contemporary brand name in a minimalist logo. It sounds an awful lot like Apple. So what Johnson did to a great extent is he reasoned by analogy. He looked at the problem JCPenney was facing and he said, look, have I seen something like this before? I've seen it at Target. I've seen it at Apple. So let me take elements of what worked there and then let me just merely assume that they are going to work at JCPenney. And that was the real killer. This is what reasoning by analogy often does. It leads you to have a mistaken belief in your solution. Mistaken in the sense that you don't question whether it's right or wrong. You simply assume it's right, and therefore you don't bother to test it. Johnson never bothered to test his solution. When he was asked by someone inside the organization, and again, when we were researching the book, we read this in multiple press articles, he allegedly was asked, maybe you should think about testing this, maybe at one or two stores before you rolled this out across the entire chain. And Johnson's retort was, we didn't test at Apple. So if we didn't test at Apple, why are we going to test at JCPenney? So again, getting all the way back to your question, even highly experienced senior executives who have spent their entire career within a single industry can still fall prey to the trap, the pitfall of reasoning by analogy.
As a strategy consultant, how do you wrestle with this idea of empathy and humanity? And I know, emotional intelligence is big buzz right now. How are you working with individuals who you see that part of their inability to make certain decisions may be tied into other things, something that have happened in their developmental cycle, or I'm sure as a strategy consultant, people share personal information with you. How do you kind of walk that line with them, appeal to their humanity, but then hold them to standards and kind of bring them ahead?
Well, you mentioned empathy, and empathy is, I like to say, a little bit of empathy can go a very long way. And we were talking about problem solving. Empathy has a huge role to play there. And again, I'll use the example of Ron Johnson. Believing that you understood JCPenney customers, you were able to see how they experienced shopping at JCPenney only after starting 2 months, is unbelievably, I don't know what the word would be, hubris, I guess would be the right word, right? Because empathy means being able to see the world from somebody else's perspective, being able to, quote unquote, walk a mile in their shoes. And if you're solving a problem, empathy is important because you want to be able to see the way the people that are experiencing the problem experience it. The reason this is important is because it forces you to get outside of your own head. And getting outside of your own head means opening up yourself the possibility to solutions that you never dreamed of before. So empathy is powerful in a problem-solving process because if you can see the world from the user's perspective, the customer's perspective, if we're talking about leadership, people that are on your team, their perspective, it can open yourself up to opportunities to lead in a different way, to solve problems in a different way. But what it requires an investment in empathy. It requires an investment in sitting down with people and not assuming you know what they're going to say, but asking them simple, open-ended questions to try to explore what are their beliefs, how do they think about a particular problem, particular challenge, what do they like about it, what do they don't like about it. Again, and then using that to come up with ways to think about, well, if it's a problem, how do we solve it? If it's an issue with leadership, using that insight to do a better job of tailoring your leadership approach to that individual, because leadership is such a situation-specific thing. And the extent to which you don't know anything or very little about the people that you're trying to lead means you're in your own head. You're making assumptions about what's going to motivate people, what's going to help them develop in their roles. And these assumptions may be misguided. So I like to say, again, leadership, a little bit of empathy can go a long way, whether we're talking about problem solving or whether we're talking about leading inside organizations.
For some of the individuals who listen to this podcast, some of the terminology may be lost on us. So as a professor, can you help us out with when you say critical thinking and when you say problem solving, how do you define that for the student just coming in? Because some of us, when we hear problem solving, is, oh, I have an answer and I'm giving my
Yeah,
answer and I'm a problem solver.
yeah.
But in this world that we're talking about, those aren't synonymous. So walk us through from with the professor hat what you mean by
Sure,
that.
sure. No, I appreciate the opportunity to do that. So I think for most people, and certainly for me as a professor, when I think of a problem, I think that there's some sort of trouble. In other words, there's the current state of affairs, there's the status quo, and then there's what you'd like it to be. And generally speaking, if there's a gap between those two things, we put the label of problem on it.
Hmm.
So again, I mentioned just a little bit ago, I was doing a workshop back in the Middle East last week, and one of the participants in the workshop, he said, I have an attrition problem. And I said, well, what do you mean? Why do you think you have an attrition problem? And he said, well, 20% of my employees every year are leaving. And I said, okay, so I'm going to assume that you're telling me that's too high. And he said, yes, that's too high. And I said, well, okay, what's an acceptable level of attrition for you on an annual basis for your employees? He said 5%. So here we have a problem. He wants 5% attrition every year, maximum. And what he's actually facing is 20% attrition. So that's a problem because the current state of affairs, employee attrition is 20%. The desired state of affairs, employee attrition is 5%. So the question is, how do I close that gap? That's the problem solving question. How might I reduce employee attrition in my organization from 20% to 5%? And then again, you need to be specific about the time horizon. Are we going to do this in 1 year? Are we going to do this in 2 years? So a problem, we tend to call a situation a problem when the current state of affairs is less desirable than what we want. And then that raises the question, what are we going to do about this? That then goes into a search for solutions. In other words, a problem solving process. So if you have people that identify, well, I'm a problem solver, I think what they're saying is I have the ability to identify situations in life and maybe in my organization where the desired state is not what the reality is. And then I have a toolkit that helps me walk through identifying what potential solutions would be and then evaluating those. You can call that process of problem solving critical thinking, because critical thinking means I'm not going to just simply assume something is happening, and I'm not going to just use my own intuition. I'm going to use frameworks, concepts, theories, use whatever you want to try to understand the situation, then try to use those frameworks, tools, and theories to help me identify what potential solutions are. So in the context of the gentleman's attrition problem, we have lots of theories of human motivation out there. In other words, we have a rich body of knowledge that helps us understand why some employees stay in an organization and why some employees leave.
Hmm.
Well, let's use that to then figure out what's going on in his organization. And why is it that 20% are leaving? And then once we can sort of get down to the root cause, we can start identifying what the potential solutions are. In his mind, he immediately jumped to the solution of, I'm not paying my people enough. And after a bit of investigation and applying some of the tools and frameworks in the book, he realized that maybe there's a lot more going on to this employee attrition problem than he realizes. And he has to do a bit more investigation and probably a bit more data collection to really figure out what's driving this attrition problem before he can come up with a solution. That is critical thinking.
There's a section of the book, and it's so much. It's so much in here. Like every section is worth the price of the book. But there's a
Thank you.
section in here that I think we can dovetail into very nicely. That you talk about the pitfalls of problem solving, or we kind of have this idea of what it takes to solve a problem. But if we're off in one of these 5 areas, it could throw everything for a loop. So can you teach us through the pitfalls of problem solving and how we can overcome those?
Yeah. So we talk about 5 different pitfalls, and we call them pitfalls because these are things that we as human beings tend to face when we solve problems. And the first one that we start with in the book is what we call the flawed problem definition. What this really means is that we spend very little time, if any, trying to define what the problem is we're solving. Why is that the case? Well, trying to state the problem or define it isn't sexy. It isn't fun. What's more interesting for most people is to start talking about their ideas for solutions. In other words, start talking about their idea for the answer. So one of my favorite Einstein quotes that sort of captures this is he said, once upon a time, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend the first 55 minutes trying to understand it, trying to define it, and then the last 5 minutes actually solving it. His point was, you can't effectively solve a problem unless you understand what's going on. In other words, unless you have a good definition of the problem. And in so many cases inside organizations and even in life, we often don't take the time to step back and ask myself, what tells me I have a problem? In other words, what's the trouble? And then probably as importantly, how am I going to know if this thing's effectively solved? In other words, what's success? So again, what this is telling us is if you face a pitfall, if it's sort of hardwired into us as human beings, then we need a way to overcome the pitfall. That's largely what the rest of the book is about, is the toolkit to overcome these pitfalls. In our case, it's that TSCA framework that I mentioned before, which is a framework that helps you define the problem. So flawed problem definition is one. A really quick example of that is the music industry when music went digital. When music went digital, this started back in the 80s with the CD and then accelerated with the rise of the internet and these peer-to-peer platforms like Napster, for example. The recorded music industry in the United States framed the problem basically as this: how do we stop piracy? So they looked at this problem of declining sales, and in their minds, declining sales was caused by people sharing music illegally, not paying for it. So they framed the problem as piracy. And as soon as you say this is a piracy problem, it's very obvious what the solution is. The solution is to get an army of lawyers to sue everybody and prevent piracy, which is exactly what the recorded music industry did in the US. They hired an army of attorneys and they went out and sued not just organizations, but individual. They were largely successful. They shut down a lot of these peer-to-peer sharing sites. They stopped a lot of this activity. They spent a ton of money doing it, hundreds of millions of dollars. It didn't have the effect on sales. Now, that's one way to frame the problem, but there's a different way to frame the problem. You could also frame the problem as, how do I make money on digital music? This is the way Apple and others frame the problem. It wasn't necessarily saying that declining sales is contributed to piracy. They said declining sales may have something to do about the digitalization of music, so let's figure out how to make money using digitized music. And as a result, Apple, we know, set up iTunes, but the iPod preceded that. So a very different solution. So again, what this tells us is that we need to be disciplined in how we define problems, because how we define it will greatly influence the type of solution and the quality of the solution that we come up with. The other ones I'll just go quickly through. The other one is, the next one is what we call the solution confirmation bias. I think the Ron Johnson story is a great example of that. What that means is basically we're very quick as human beings to jump to a solution, as we were talking about at the top of the discussion. I get a little bit of information, an idea pops into my mind. I think I know exactly what's going on. And once I have an idea for a solution, what happens? Anybody that comes along and says, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? In other words, they question our solution. What we often do is we either ignore what they say or we seek to discredit what they say. In other words, we seek to confirm our beliefs and we seek to discredit or ignore information that's inconsistent with our beliefs. And what that does is that it helps us jump to a solution very quickly and then rush to implement that solution. So again, we need ways to push back against us, which is, again, why there are tools in the book to do that. The third one is what we call the wrong framework problem. And the wrong framework problem, it basically recognizes the fact that as human beings, we make sense of our world through our experience. And you said this earlier. And if you have any formal education, you are taught ways to make sense of the world. So in business school, you are taught theories of motivation, and you're taught how to make financial decisions, and you're taught how to market a service or a product. What we do as business faculty is we give you lots of frameworks. And what those frameworks do is that they help you sort of make sense of the world. Now, what we mean by the wrong framework problem is oftentimes we try to force information that we have available to us to fit our frameworks. The best example I can give you is when making financial decisions, most organizations will say, if we're going to invest capital in something, we're going to use a tool called net present value, discounted cash flow tool, to decide whether or not we should make this investment. So it's a tool. And that tool, any person that works in finance says, okay, any financial decision-making situation, I'm going to use this tool. I don't care if it's appropriate or not. I know this tool. I'm comfortable with this tool. Sometimes that tool works, but in other times it doesn't work. In situations where you have a very difficult time understanding what the future cash flows will be, that's the wrong tool. But because it's the only tool in our arsenal, we try to force the world to fit to that tool. And that can again lead to bad solutions being developed. The fourth one that we talk about there is I already talked about with the Ron Johnson story. That is reasoning by analogy. And the last one we talk about is miscommunication. Because in problem solving, at the end of this, you're going to hopefully have a solution. And what's likely you're going to need to do is you're going to need to get buy-in from other people, either inside the organization or outside. In other words, you're going to have to sell your solution. You're going to have to pitch it. So you need a way to come up with a persuasive, compelling story. And what often happens is people, especially, I would say, inexperienced managers, they often don't use an effective storytelling structure. They often use what I like to call the story of how. In other words, they'll explain to you how they arrived at the solution, but nobody cares about that. What we care about is why should we adopt this solution, right? Give me the reasons and the underlying evidence to support those reasons as to why I should buy your product, right? Why I should listen to you about this solution to my attrition problem. So all of these are pitfalls, and largely what the book is essentially a methodology that is designed to try to push back against these pitfalls.
You mentioned selling your solution. Give us a snapshot, maybe 30 seconds or so, of why people should buy their own copy of Cracked It and what's the difference it can make as they go through with the research you share in this book.
So this would be my 30-second sales pitch. So number one, we know that problem solving is extremely important, both inside organizations and out. There's lots of data and statistics that suggest that. Number two, we also know that human beings, it doesn't necessarily come naturally to us in how to solve problems. It's not like learning how to walk. So even highly experienced individuals get tripped up, like the Ron Johnson story. And number three, most of us haven't been taught how to solve problems well. In other words, we've been taught lots of tools and frameworks through our different educational backgrounds, but no one has come along and given us an overarching, disciplined, rigorous approach to problem solving. That is precisely what we do in the book. We provide a disciplined, structured, rigorous approach to problem solving that can be used for your life as well as your work. So that's my hopefully 30-second pitch for the book.
My guest today has been Dr. Corey Phelps. He is a keynote speaker, corporate trainer, award-winning business school professor, and co-author of the book Cracked It: How to Solve Big Problems and Sell Solutions Like Top Strategy Consultants. Corey, thanks for being my guest today.
Thanks very much, Pierre. I appreciate the opportunity.
Great conversation with Corey Phelps about his book, Cracked It: How to Solve Big Problems and Sell Solutions Like Top Strategy Consultants. And as leaders, we struggle with critical thinking and with problem solving. We struggle with having the right framework to address the challenges in our organizations. And sometimes we jump to conclusions. So I encourage you to get a copy of Corey's book. You can do that at crackeditbook.com. I'll leave the links in the show notes so you can find it quickly and easily. Hey, that's all I got for this episode of the Leading While Green podcast, where it's my mission to help you live, learn, and lead with confidence. If you want to help me with my mission, hop over to Apple Podcasts, leave a 5-star review and some comments, and share this episode on your social media. Let other people know about this Leading While Green journey that we are on together. So until next time, Take care and God bless.